Hello, hello. Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with the contemporary issues presentation. Good morning, good morning. Come on and sit down, you all. It's fine. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for sticking around for this. We know some of you have places to be after church, so no worries if you need to leave when you need to leave. I'm really excited about this presentation. When we were planning the Contemporary Issues series for this programming year, we were anticipating the spring, and we know that Earth Day is coming up. Next Monday is Earth Day. And Darcy and I know also that one of the most common questions we get when working with youth in their faith journeys is, what does our faith have to say about what we're learning in school about science? And particularly young people are incredibly concerned about the climate crisis and climate change. So I'm so grateful that Contemporary Issues decided to go in this direction and that we have these wonderful speakers with us this morning. Rowan Tucker Meyer and Alyssa Moore are here to speak about the work of the Sunrise Movement in Ann Arbor. And the Reverend Dr. Brooks Barrett is here as a representative of the United Church of Christ national staff, and he'll be speaking about the work of the UCC nationally. We'll just give it a minute. Rowan is a junior at the University of Missouri, and Alyssa is working on I'm from Missouri. At the University of Michigan, and Alyssa's working on a Master of Social Work degree. They are movement participants and active in environmental justice work here in Michigan, and specifically, as I've mentioned, with Sunrise Ann Arbor. And in their other lives, they write, Rowan is a musician, and as I said, Alyssa's a Master of Social Work student. Before becoming the United Church of Christ Minister for Environmental Justice in 2015, Brooks served as a pastor in Vancouver, Washington, where he was active in 2 successful environmental campaigns, transitioning the state of Washington away from its only coal plant and preventing the establishment of the largest marine oil terminal in the country in Vancouver. During his time as pastor, Barrett co-authored a book with the Reverend Dr. J. Alfred Smith entitled Sounding the Trumpet: How Churches Can Answer God's Call to Justice. And Brooks' second book is called Cathedral on Fire: A Church Handbook from the Climate Crisis. Brooks, am I right that you have copies of those today? Okay, Brooks has copies with today. Brooks edits an environmental justice newsletter called The Pollinator, and he co-hosts a monthly webinar that has featured a range of guests, from climate scientist Katherine Hayhoe to Senator Cory Booker. So we're grateful to all 3 of you for being here. Thank you. I've asked them to start out by giving a brief presentation, about 10 to 15 minutes or so, answering 3 questions, both telling us about the history of the organization that they work with and the particular work they do. What does the work they're doing to address the climate crisis look like? And how and why did they get personally involved in this work? So we'll begin hearing from Rowan and Alyssa.
Thanks so much. All right, fantastic. I'm Rowan. Yeah, that's me. Alyssa. You know, Lily kind of covered the essentials. So yeah, why and how do we get involved with Sunrise Ann Arbor? Speaking for myself, like many people of my generation, I've always been pretty aware that there is a climate emergency going on that requires serious change of course, serious action. And there was just a certain point where I just felt like I could no longer be on the sidelines, and I had to actually play, I had a responsibility as someone alive in this moment in time to see what I can do to halt this catastrophe. And I heard about the Sunrise Movement, and I thought the work they were doing around the Green New Deal was like really impactful and powerful. And it's just a really, welcoming space for young people who had never really been involved in activism before. So that's kind of what drew me to Sunrise.
Yeah, for myself, very similar to Rowan. I think I was mostly driven by just feeling like I was kind of like stuck in like this anxiety of like, what is my future going to look like? And I'm sure that's something that a lot of people can resonate with in terms of, what is the world going to look like in 50 years when I'm an adult and I'm, trying to figure out life or whatever is going on. So I got involved with Sunrise and Arbor feeling like I couldn't just sit in that anxiety anymore, and I had to be like actively doing something for my own mental health and also just for the world around me and my obligation to my community. So that's what got me involved in Sunrise and Arbor. I think the Sunrise Movement in particular, I was drawn to because of how focused it is on environmental justice and recognizing how all forms of oppression intersect. So in being involved with climate activism, I'm not just working on the climate, I'm also working for justice across like the whole country in a lot of different areas. So yeah. Was I doing this one? Okay. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the Sunrise Movement and what hubs are. So what is the Sunrise Movement? We've kind of already covered this a little bit, but we are a youth movement focused on climate justice and also advocating for the Green New Deal, which is a piece of policy that we'll talk about in a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, Sunrise has like a national movement across the whole country and then also has like local hubs like Sunrise and Arbor that are doing stuff in our communities.
Yeah, so this is how the Sunrise Movement naturally defines itself. Sunrise is building a mass movement of young people to combat the climate crisis and create millions of good jobs in the process. That's kind of their mission statement.
Yeah, so what is the Green New Deal? So the Green New Deal is kind of like a framework for policy almost, where it's like talking about this intersection between climate justice and also ensuring that people who are on the front line of the climate crisis are not left behind in a just transition away from fossil fuel. So a lot of times I think in politics, sometimes it's the perception is like, oh, either we're doing like economic investment or we're spending all this ridiculous amount of money on like climate change. And our perspective with the Green New Deal is no, these two things can come together. We can be advocating for good jobs, livable wages, while also transitioning away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, so the Green New Deal is like a policy proposal that has not been implemented yet. That's the big fight at the national level. But as we'll talk about a little later, the local chapters of the Sunrise Movement, like their work sometimes relates to the Green New Deal, but sometimes it relates to like other initiatives. Anyway, but yes, the Green New Deal, this is a summary of like some of the most important like pillars of this ambitious policy. 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030. That was the original proposal. At this point, it might have to be pushed back. Job guarantee for every American who needs one. This is kind of inspired by the New Deal, how it essentially ended unemployment by putting people to work on these infrastructure projects because, there's a lot of economic hardship in this country, obviously, and there's also so much work to be done to build up clean energy infrastructure and all that kind of thing. So it's kind of, solving two problems at once by having a jobs program, putting people to work on these projects. Investments prioritizing frontline communities. What this basically means is like, a lot of times the effects of climate change or pollution within our country are, they're basically subjected mainly to like black neighborhoods, indigenous reservations. This is where they're building these, polluting plants and stuff like that, because these communities are like viewed as like disposable. So this is like a, rejection of that logic that has like lasted in this country for so long. And yeah, overhaul of transportation, infrastructure, agricultural systems, all that good stuff is part of the Green New Deal.
Yeah, so as mentioned before, there's the national movement of Sunrise that does a lot of that policy advocacy like on a federal level, and then there's also local hubs in Sunrise. So Sunrise Ann Arbor is a local hub here in Ann Arbor, and also to some extent the wider Washtenaw County, and we are basically working on either like Green New Deal related policies in our like local areas or other issues related to the climate crisis that catch our attention. So we'll go in a little bit more detail about what our hub specifically has been up to.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get a little into the history of like Sunrise Ann Arbor. Our first major campaign was related to the Green New Deal, and it was particularly pressuring Congresswoman Debbie Dingell to try to get her to be a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal when this legislation was first introduced. She was very resistant to co-sponsoring the Green New Deal. She does take campaign donations from DT Energy, which is a coal company, Chevron, these fossil fuel companies. So for her to support something that gets rid of the fossil fuel industries would be in conflict with that situation. So there were a series of educational events and a series of protests, sit-ins at her office, and these actions would escalate, but ultimately Debbie Dingell was like resistant and would not co-sponsor the Green New Deal. But at the same time now, it's kind of confusing. Like she says that she co-sponsors the Green New Deal, like she sponsors some of the legislation. So it wasn't a complete victory, but she's definitely become more of a leader on climate than she was before all of these young people started yelling at her.
Yeah, definitely. And then more recently, we've also been doing some more like community events and fundraisers. So 2 summers ago, we did a concert to shut down Line 5. If you aren't familiar with Line 5, it's a oil pipeline that runs underneath the Straits of Mackinac. Okay, lots of folks are, that's awesome. Yeah, so we did a fundraising concert for groups of people who were protesting it, as well as a Detroit-based Indigenous Mutual Aid Network. So at the concert, we had like a lot of local performers coming out, and we also had like a lot of speakers just kind of educating on the issue. And then last spring, we also did a concert and pop-up thrift fundraiser with a neutral zone, which was focused on fundraising for folks in East Palestine, Ohio, where the train derailment happened last year, to help out with some of the effects of the train derailment and make sure people are getting their health needs met.
Yeah, so that brings us to our current campaign, which is part of a larger national movement called Stop Cop City. This is referring to a proposed development in Atlanta where the Atlanta Police Foundation is attempting to destroy a vast area of forest, the largest urban forest in the United States, in order to build a police training facility whose purpose is to train the police in new methods of dealing with urban uprisings. It's essentially a response to the inspiring George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, and where a lot of police officers quit in response to that. So this is kind of an attempt to boost morale, but also to prevent those protests from happening again. So it is very much a racial justice issue and is targeted at Atlanta's predominantly black population. And at the same time, it's a serious ecological issue because getting rid of this forest means more flooding in Atlanta, higher temperatures, and also, of course, it impacts our entire ecosystem because, we need the trees to, store carbon. So anyways, the way that we get into that is the Stop Cop City movement, one of its strengths has been in targeting different companies that are supporting this project rather than targeting the Atlanta Police Foundation directly who are so invested in it, but looking at, for example, insurance companies that are supporting this and targeting these companies to see if they can pull out of their contract and kind of removing the pillars of support. So we learned that one of the 2 insurance companies behind this project just happened to be an hour away from us in Lansing, and it's called Accident Fund, and they're providing workers' compensation insurance. So basically our goal is to put enough pressure on them to want to drop this contract, which would halt construction and preserve the forest. Yeah. So that's looked like different protests in front of their headquarters. even protests at the mansion of their CEO, and phone calls, emails, all of that. And right now we're trying to reach out to different businesses and organizations that are insured by Accident Fund, and trying to see if other businesses might want to, communicate with Accident Fund and say, we don't want to work with you anymore if you're insuring this, destructive project. So that's what we're working on at the moment. And that's all we got. That's everything. Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Okay, thank you all. We're going to have Brooks come up and give his presentation. So save questions. We'll get to questions once Brooks is finished with his presentation.
All right. Great to be here this morning. I'm almost hesitant to say a little bit about my background because I came from another Big Ten town. Yeah, but I must say, Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. But I must say, I'm often filled with envy. Seems like every Saturday in the fall, I'm just think to myself, what it would be like to know I have guaranteed happiness on a Saturday, and so yes, I'm often envious. But to say something about how I got involved in working on environmental issues, I grew up in a church where it probably wasn't much of something that we learned about on Sundays. I do remember an Earth Day celebration that was interfaith and next to a pond, but other than that, there wasn't too much there. And so it wasn't until I became a pastor that I was starting to learn about climate change and thought something must be done. And so I decided to join the Sierra Club was launching a campaign to transition away from the state's only coal plant. And we were in a race with Oregon to be the first coal-free state in the country. We just barely lost to Oregon on that one. But it was during that time as I learned about the coal plant and the different pollutants that I became sort of motivated in a whole different way than ever before in addressing environmental issues, because I was a parent in the making. My wife was expecting our first child, and I began to read about the impact of mercury that comes from the coal plant that it can have on pregnant women, on babies, on young children, in terms of neurological damage and so forth. And I thought, wow, something has to be done about this. And it's really, I would say, that's my number one motive still today is I'm in this because I care about my now 8 and 12-year-old daughters, right? That's why I'm involved in this work. And so, which really relates to the themes I want to talk about today. Really, the environmental justice movement, which began in the late 1970s and 80s to the present, one can tell that story in a way that focuses on how often environmental justice is generationally driven in terms of the younger generation provoking and leading the way. And also it involves intergenerational solidarity, when one generation cares deeply enough to be committed to take action for another generation. And so, I just want to point back to the origins of the environmental justice movement, in which faith leaders played a central role. Back in Warren County, North Carolina, there was a time when the state had encountered a bunch of PCBs that a company had been hired by the state to deliver outside, and they decided to save some money. They would not deliver it to another state. In the middle of the night, they sprayed thousands and thousands of gallons of PCBs along country roadsides. And so people in the community saw what looked like people wearing spacesuits, is what they thought. We now call them hazmat suits. Inspecting the damage that had been done and trying to figure out how to clean it up. And so we know kind of common sense would tell you the last thing you want to do when you've got kind of a known carcinogen like PCBs is you don't want to put it near a high water table level. But that's exactly what the state did because they were operating according to a different calculation, right? Jim Crow segregation still, that history is still alive and well in North Carolina, and so they decided to place it in the community with the highest black population and some of the highest poverty rates in North Carolina, and that was Warren County. In Warren County, the UCC had some of its strongest leadership coming out of the civil rights movement. One of the leaders of that, two of the leaders from that movement lived in Warren County. Dolly Burwell became a leader in that struggle, the lead organizer. She was on the board for Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization. Her pastor, the Reverend Leon White, was the leader for the UCC's Commission for Racial Justice, which was our civil rights arm. And so they started to organize in the local community. And for Dolly Burwell, she was organizing because she was concerned about her two daughters. She was concerned about them growing up in a community with PCBs. And so on the morning that the dump trucks were to begin arriving in their community, they marched from a local church and began putting their bodies on the road to prevent those dump trucks from arriving. Her 8-year-old daughter, Kim, refused to go to school that day and went with her. And while her mother was being loaded onto a paddy wagon, Dan Rather interviewed her, and that interview went across the nation on TV and really pricked the consciousness of a nation. And Kim would later say she was crying during the interview. She would later say she wasn't crying because her mother was being arrested. She was crying because she was afraid of the PCBs. Kim, later that day, as an 8-year-old, was arrested and detained in her school. So this was the beginning of a 6-week civil disobedience campaign in which over 500 people were arrested. The second day of that campaign, the Reverend Benjamin Chavis, a UCC minister who had spent a number of years in prison in North Carolina being unjustly framed as a community organizer for arson, he was eventually found innocent and pardoned. So he wasn't out of prison very long. And so the last thing he wanted to do was go back to a North Carolina jail cell. And as he was driving to bail people out on that second day, he was arrested for driving too slow. And so he ended up in jail, and it was, as he tells the story, it was while he was in that jail cell, he said, this is environmental racism. And he's credited with coining that phrase, environmental racism. So that lasted, for 6 weeks. You had a congressman get arrested. People from all over the country came to that. One fact that doesn't often get recognized is out of those 500 or so people who were arrested and were then detained in a local hotel, 94 of those people were listed as juveniles. So you had children and youth who were getting arrested as part of that movement. Again, pointing to kind of the generationally driven nature that we then see over and over again in the environmental justice movement. So to kind of bring things forward as another example of these dynamics, we can look to Flint, Michigan. When you look at the lead activists for that struggle, one of them said, if it wasn't for mad moms, nothing would have ever happened in Flint, right? It was really largely mothers who initiated and drove that movement in Flint to call attention to the lead poisoning of the water. So again, you see this intergenerational commitment that really drives movements often. In terms of the generationally driven change element, we again see that quite clearly in the climate justice movement. What happened in Standing Rock some years ago, largely initiated and driven by an organization, a youth group called the International Indigenous Youth Council, right? They were the ones that began camping out and leading that effort. And they were doing relay races across the country to Washington, D.C. as well. Then, of course, with the climate strike movement again, we see the generationally driven nature of the movement. Now, to circle back to churches and what we see in churches related to this, we know that the number one reason that church people get involved on climate issues is because of members who care about their children or grandchildren. That's the leading reason for why church people get involved. I want to just mention 5 ways, 5 examples we've seen this in the United Church of Christ. Some years ago, we had one of our youth, son of a pastor, now one of my colleagues, was part of the youth who sued the federal government over climate change. Still kind of an ongoing case called Juliana versus the United States, and Juliana versus the United States. And so one of the things we did, realizing that often the most motivating thing for congregations is hear directly from youth and young adults. And so we had a campaign to have youth and young adults preach on Sunday mornings in solidarity with those in that court case. Other things I've seen, we have a green church program called Creation Justice Churches. I've seen youth lead their churches through that process of becoming a Creation Justice church. Last year and this year, we've had an art contest for children and youth that is tied to our campaigns, our climate campaigns. We call them Climate Hope campaigns. And what we did last year is we took the winning art from that, 16-year-old in Ohio, and we put it on postcards that we then distribute throughout the country for church members to sign and to collect, and that we delivered in person to the senior leadership of the EPA. And that was part of a broader coalition effort, realizing that certain EPA protections, if they were strengthened, would get our country into kind of shooting distance of having a carbon-free electrical grid by 2035, while also reducing some of the disparities that we've been talking about in terms of public health, along the lines of race and economics and poverty. So that was our campaign last year. This year, we're again in the midst of an art contest where the winning art will go on a Climate Hope voter pledge card. And we know that we had our local church leaders to tell us what they wanted to focus on this year, and the top priority for this year was electing climate justice champions to office. And so we'll be doing that this summer. We hire youth and young adults to help lead that effort. If you know any youth or young adults who would like to be hired by my office, I've got cards right there, happy to send an application for it to become involved in that. One of the things that we find powerful still is having youth and young adults show up in church on a Sunday morning and participate and speak in the worship service. The last thing I'll mention related to wonderful people you heard speak earlier, we also in the United Church of Christ passed a resolution in 2019 in support of the Green New Deal, and we're happy then to do an event with Varshini Prakash, the executive director at that time of the Sunrise Movement, to help promote the Green New Deal in our denominations. And that, I think, really has, in many ways, impacted the way our goals, right? We were very much focused on what needs to be done at the federal level. Everything needs to be done at all levels, but realizing that if you work your way back from the problem, ultimately we need solutions that are at the scale of the problem. And so the analogy I often give is if you saw a wildfire coming towards your house, you wouldn't get a watering can and a garden hose to fight it, right? You would call somebody. In this case, we need to call upon the federal government to be able to act on the scale necessary. And so doing that in a way that's mindful of all the intersecting justice issues that are involved with climate justice really shapes our goals. And the Sunrise Movement, I would credit as being the foremost organization in leading that movement in the United States. And so really grateful for their work and grateful to be with you all today. So I think I'll wrap it up there and we'll turn towards questions.
Thank you. Thanks for the work you do and for your willingness to be here this morning and share with us about it. I'm reminded of Darcy's children's circle with the balloon. If you didn't get to see it this morning, Darcy had a balloon that she wanted the kids to get from one end of the front of the sanctuary to the other, and she had one of our strong young people go stand up in the pulpit and throw it with all her might to get it there, and it didn't work. And so they had to work together, and each of them gave their own skills and passions and talents to bounce the balloon over to the choir side of the sanctuary. So thank you for sharing with us what your passions and talents and skills and angles are for this gigantic challenge that we face as a community of humanity. We will move into questions, and I have one to start us off. I know also that our middle school youth discussed this morning. Do any of you have questions to bring? No? Okay, all right. So I guess to start us off with the questions, I would love to hear from each of you, I guess like a story or experience of that brings you great hope in the work you're doing, and then also sharing, if you would, about one of the greatest challenges you face in the work you do. To keep it nice and simple.
Yes, hello. In terms of hope, I mean, I think I'm like, how do I say this? It brings me hope to like, I can't speak. Okay, I think that like having a small group of people, like sometimes you can accomplish more than you realize, and sometimes a lot of the barriers to taking action are more like mental than real. And I think that like just by saying we're gonna do this, this is how we're gonna attack this problem, and just trying to like put it into action and just taking the right steps, like you can actually make things happen even if you don't have like, you know, you're going up against a big company or you're just a couple of young people, you know. I think that's what gives me hope, is seeing that like play out in a few different scenarios. In terms of challenges, I think a challenge is that it's very hard for a lot of people to see themselves as someone who could like take a role in like movement work. And I think a lot of people, you know, there's so much going on that we have to deal with, that we think that like, you know, we can't, you know, possibly have the time or the energy to contribute to these movements, especially since we're dealing with such humongous issues. And I think that ends up being an issue because a lot of people sit on the sidelines, when really, if we, you know, had larger numbers, then, you know, and larger participation throughout broad like sections of society, then we could see like an even bigger shift in this country.
Yeah, I can add on to that, honestly. I don't think there's like one specific moment that I can like point to where I'm like, oh yeah, that was a moment that gave me a lot of hope. I think it's just the collective, like, I've been in Sunrise for about 2 years now, and just like the recurring showing up to our action team meetings and like seeing like, yeah, this is like a group of people who are committed to making changes, and being the change makers in this country, and like, you know, like, oh, there's other people. That's not just me, you know, who are like really stressed about this and who are actually going to like show up for this. I think that that has been the most motivating thing, is just like not being alone in this. And I think I would just agree with Rowan in saying like even a small group of people can really make a good big impact. Like Sunrise and Arbor is like less than 10 people right now, but we're still doing this campaign, arguably. You know, arguably. But I think like going off of that also, like we've done so much coalition building, and that's been like something that's also been so inspiring, is seeing like, you know, it's starting with that group of like less than 10 people. Now we have like this massive like group chat of people all over the state who want to be involved with this. And it's like, wow, like, you know, that was something that we just started in like a little library room. So that's, you know, really cool to see and really inspiring, just to like see that solidarity. I think a challenge is definitely just like, this is like relevant because yesterday we had like a big meeting about like burnout, because that's something that a lot of us are dealing with right now, is just like the everyday work that just like compounds, and just like seeing the way that society is so slow to change can be in some way very demoralizing. And I think the challenge has just been like figuring out how can we balance like when people need to step back and take a break and deal with their own lives and then come back in refreshed, and how do we make sure that like it doesn't just like shut us down and we're able to keep going and keep moving with the people who are able to keep moving. And then just, it's a long process. It's not something that just happens overnight. So how do we sustain ourselves, and how do we sustain the movement, and keep that joy in the organizing and not just the stress? So that's been on my mind a lot lately too.
Yeah, I think I'll build on what was just said, and something that kind of crystallized things for me was some years ago I was in Atlanta with a bunch of Methodists, and we were there for a climate conference, and we spent part of the time on kind of an old railway line that had been converted into green space, and there was a huge, like 18-foot tall statue under that a church had created by organizing people in the community to pick up trash and then turn it into this giant sculpture of a man who had been homeless, but then was able to work his way out of homelessness by a community surrounding him and kind of just giving him a lot of love and support. And right next to that, not far from that statue, there's a sign that said, "When I becomes we, even illness becomes wellness." And so I often think about that, because I think kind of the best moments for me are those we moments. So when we were meeting with the EPA senior leadership in Washington, D.C., and we were listening to a 16-year-old, tell the EPA what needed to be done, right? I knew in that moment that it was a we moment. That was made possible by thousands of people throughout the country, participating in an action. And so it's those we moments that give me hope, especially.
Thank you all. Okay, we'll take questions now. Who has questions? Yeah, Diane?
Well, first of all, to call this, I think it's wrong in calling it climate change. Climate is a very big thing, but we need to change to cleanliness, or label it that way, because that's what we as people can do something about. The major climate, I mean, this church was probably through miles of snow and ice. And so it's the sun and the changes there. But we should rechange the name of it to cleanliness, or water, air, and ground cleanness, or something like that, and not call it climate change.
Diane, did you have a question or just wanted to share the comment? Okay. All right, any other questions? Eric?
Thanks. I was just wondering if the Sunrise Movement was working with like any other groups in Atlanta, or is it like the local Ann Arbor chapter? Is it working with like a Atlanta chapter of the Sunrise Movement, or how is that going?
Sure. That's a great question. I'm not honestly sure how active the Sunrise Movement Atlanta chapter is. Most of the work, because it's so we're so specifically targeting this company based in Michigan. We've been doing a lot of work with different Michigan organizations, but that is something that we are missing, is more connection with the organizing going down in Atlanta. Yeah, there are. I have had the opportunity to meet with different people, including from Atlanta, but around the country, who are working on this Stop Cop City issue. But there hasn't been as much like formal like coalition building with Atlanta organizers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll say also the Stop Cop City thing is something that like our hub in particular just like had an interest in and noticed that we were like in proximity to this insurance company and so decided to take on. And so like, I don't know, like it's not necessarily like a Sunrise specific movement. It's a movement that's like a collection of a lot of different organizations that are just seeing the need and have the same sort of like missions and values that are coming together to support this movement as well.
I'm a mom of a high schooler and a middle schooler. Do you have any opportunities for kids of that age to be involved, to volunteer, write letters?
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh, oh my gosh, this just hit my mask and made a sound. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We have some high schoolers who are in our hub right now. I think that that's definitely something that if they're interested in getting involved, we'd love to have them. I don't know, like, yeah, like, I mean, we've never had middle schoolers at our hub, but I don't know what age range.
History, yes.
We have? Okay.
It's not
Yeah.
unprecedented.
It's not unprecedented. Okay, yeah. So I'd say definitely if they're interested in being involved, we have regular meetings. We usually do like some sort of onboarding process for people who are interested where we meet with them one-on-one and just kind of have like a conversation about like what brings you here, what are you interested in working on, how can we support you with getting involved, any questions you have, like that sort of thing. So we have an interest form somewhere. You can also email us at sunrisemvmta2@gmail.com if you're interested in getting involved. I'll give it another second. Okay, it's Sunrise M like
It's
like movement.
but without
yeah.
some of the letters.
MVMT and then A2 like Ann Arbor @gmail.com.
Yeah.
Gmail. Yeah, so if anyone is interested in getting involved or meeting with us more to learn about stuff that we're doing, you can absolutely get in contact with us there. And maybe we can like send along like our interest form or Linktree information to someone here or something like that to make that connection. I don't know, anything you want to add?
Yeah, wide variety of ways to get involved.
Definitely.
So I don't think I missed this, but this question is for both the younger and the experienced. So what it tweaked in my mind, you said you had a 16-year-old testifying to the EPA about what they're supposed to be doing, right? So from your perspective and your perspective, how has it been when you have young adults and teens talking to a world of adults who feel like you can only get expertise through experience and time? Like, how is that working on both sides there?
Do you want to start? We've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I mean, with that particular instant, I would say we definitely felt like they listened more to us. Like our DC, we have a DC office. They're often doing meetings with senators. We also did a meeting with Senator Sherrod Brown's office that day, and you know, they actually you felt like there was more energy and attentiveness in the room when the 16-year-old was speaking. There's a certain kind of moral, charge and authenticity that comes from hearing a youth speak, I think, to be honest. And so that was a case in which I felt like they were listening more to her than they were to me, and so it's quite powerful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the younger generation is necessarily like always going to be right 100% of the time, but I think there is definitely value in that perspective. And I think, I mean, the idea of expertise is very like slippery. Like the EPA are, the experts, right, with the degrees, and yet we see them doing things that are really like counterintuitive and not not doing their job in the way that the EPA should ideally function. So, who is the expert?
Yeah, I think I can draw on my social work education a little bit here. We talk a lot about how people are the experts in their own experience, right? So there's a major value in the society of like education and like that sort of like formal aspect of things being like how someone becomes like experienced or like someone worth listening to. And I think that that becomes a problem in a lot of social justice movements where it is a lot of people who are marginalized or experiencing oppression that are like, hey, actually listen to us. We have this lived experience that's showing that this is really messed up, and the experts are not paying attention. So I think that like that's something to interrogate in society. I think like from like the youth perspective, I think we've definitely had people in like the accident fund related area being like, what does this group of kids know about insurance? Like, why are they out here, yelling at us? Y'all don't know what you're talking about. So like I think that in like the protest sphere, I think that there can be some sort of like these youths are just out here being angry about things for no reason. But I think like when we, as you were saying, when we do get access to like people who are actually willing to like listen to us, like I think that we are able to bring in a really valuable perspective.
So I've got the mic here. Other questions?
How are you collaborating with other organizations at U of M? I noticed there's a Sierra Club and several other organizations that are also working on some climate initiatives.
Yeah, great question. Really, I think Sunrise has taken a lot of steps, especially in the past year, to really like try to build relationships with different organizations. I mean, basically, we just try to like, send an email, meet with someone, and just like see what they're up to, how we can support, and let them know what, we're doing, and sometimes they want to, get involved in organizing or attending certain actions that we're doing, and vice versa. So, yeah, I don't know if that's exact. I mean, I can't speak to like specific like points of collaboration with like. Oh yeah, and Arbor for Public Power. That's one of our most significant partners who have a student org as well as like a non-student chapter. They're working to municipalize our energy grid so that we can like transition away from fossil fuels rather than just relying on DTE energy. So yeah, we try to turn out for them and knock doors with them, and they'll come to our events and all that good stuff.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Anybody who has an original or first question? Okay, Mary. Okay, we'll come back to you, Kelly. We'll squeeze into. Here you go, Mary.
Well, as not a member of the younger generation, I can remember Al Gore saying it'll take about 40 years for people to come around. 40 years have come and gone. And I'm still talking to people who are younger than me that are talking about their gardening and worrying that this is an El Nino year. And I say, what about global warming? Of course, we kind of gave up global warming and changed it into climate change. Well, she clearly doesn't really believe it, in spite of every year it's warmer than it was the year before and all these other things. She's still attributing it to an El Nino or something like that completely. Mm-hmm. And I think we have, as I got older, a change, we've changed the way we do our checking, our money. There's so many things that have changed for us. And it's obvious that it's very hard, and I don't know how to, in a friendly way, to an adult. I wish all churches were as strong in this kind of thing, because I think it's extremely important. I know my children, put solar panels on their houses and things like that, they do adjust to less use of energy, but it's awfully hard to change one single mind. And I really appreciate the work you're doing. And if there's a way that, you know, we can help to fund you or something that we could still do, I'd love to have just a T-shirt like Alyssa. I mean, but I can't really meet the age requirement, but I would really like to be supportive of what you do, because I think it's extremely important, and you're leading by a wonderful example. And your church too, the United Church of Christ. I think that's wonderful. It's not as strong, and certainly Western Michigan, very conservative area. So not
Thanks so
really a
much.
question.
I heard a question there. Okay, so for those of us who maybe don't fall into the category of young adults, what are ways we can plug into the work? And then circling back maybe to Diane's comment earlier, just out of curiosity, how do you call this thing that what do you call this catastrophe we're facing? How do you refer to it?
I could.
Okay.
You do it.
I think, you know, if you're asking about how to get a T-shirt specifically, there is, if you look up the Sunrise Movement online, they do have like an online store where you can order. Like that's where I got this T-shirt, was just like the online store for like the national movement. So that is a way that you can donate to the national movement. Our local movement also has an Act Blue that you can donate to, and we would always appreciate donations. We're trying to raise money right now for a training that we're trying to put on for safe protesting. So that would be very appreciated. But in terms of what we call it, I mean, I think the language we use right now is climate crisis, right? Because it is like a crisis. It's not just like this abstract thing where like climate is changing. It's where, climate has already changed. Natural disasters are more frequent. It's a crisis. So that's the language that we personally use when we're talking about it. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that also.
Yeah, there are organizations that put money into testing out language and what's most effective. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if you want to have authentic hope, you have to tell authentic truth, and the language has to reflect that. And so, trying to, it can go a little too far in coming up with things that don't even sound like you're talking about the climate crisis anymore, right? And so you just want to, I think, make sure that you're conveying the real nature and the truth of the problem, and then acting accordingly. And I think, we all have, we have decisions about how we spend our time and energy, decisions about how we spend our money. And I think certainly the Sunrise Movement, if listening to what has been said today, there's strategic choices that have been made that, you can focus all your attention on a neighbor who's a climate denialist, but maybe it's better to spend your time and energy on your member of Congress who maybe won't sign on for the Green New Deal, but actually will change and get to a better direction. And so that I think, that's a strategic choice. Like, okay, how can I put some time and energy into tabling at coffee hour so that we're contacting our member of Congress, or making phone calls to our member of Congress? I'd say we could have used a lot of that during kind of the push for Build Back Better, right? The legislation we end up getting often reflects how much pressure is being felt by those who are in the political offices. And so just keep all that in mind when you're thinking about how should I spend my time and energy. That's the thing.
How much is your book?
$5, yeah. And if you want to sign up for my newsletter, that's there as well. Thanks.
All right, can I have, oh. Ooh. I think you're going to be part of the focus group, right? So I think you started to address part of my question, where how We're not all as young as we want to be, but support Promote You. If you were to send us all away with one action to take within the next week or next month with like any kind of action, financial, people, spread your message, what would that one action you'd ask? Call to action for us.
I would make plans now for election day, and I would suggest phone banking every member of your congregation the week before the election to get them to vote, and if they need help getting to the poll, to find ways in advance to prepare to get people to the poll.
I would say, well, I would say for what we're working on right now, I think the best thing to do would be to send an email to Accident Fund, letting them know that you don't support their destruction of the South River Forest in Atlanta. If you look up their CEO, Lisa Corliss, her email's LISA.CORLESS @afgroup.com.
One more time.
LISA.CORLESS @afgroup.com, and just be like, cut the contract with Cop City. We, stop destroying the forest. I think that would be a powerful action.
Okay, that's a great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. On behalf of the Contemporary Issues Committee and the entire community at FCC Ann Arbor, we're grateful to have had this time with you.